Welcome to Leaping Larry's Revolutionary Reading Theatre.
Okay, welcome to the Reading Theatre, and today we're continuing on our read here of Gearld Horne, Counter-Revolution of 1776. If you want a link to that, you can click on this link right here. However, this just brings you to the library folder where it can be found like so. It will then be your job, once it loads, to scroll down, and near the bottom here, you will see Counter-Revolution of 1776, and you just click on Preview. So, we are on the final chapter of this book. Chapter 10, The Counter-Revolution of 1776. Everything else that we have read has been literally leading up to this chapter right here. We're going to learn about the actual counter-revolutionary event itself, in which the quote-unquote Americans rose up in a revolt against London in order to retain the slave trade and the expanding settler colonial violence. If you remember, we read last chapter about Lord Dunmore's proclamation, where he said, if there is any revolt or anybody tries to go against the crown, then he was going to arm any Africans and basically set them against the settlers, against the revolters. Lord Dunmore's proclamation effectively barred any possibility of rebel reconciliation with London. As one subsequent analyst put it, quote, "The people rose in revolt at the idea of an army composed of Africans, many fresh from the wilds of Africa, tromping through North America. The reign of terror," this arguer did, "aroused the entire colony as nothing else could have done, and, in so many words, forced war." In response to this controversial edict, Virginia militarized further, forming 32 new volunteer companies and embarking irrevocably on the road to revolt. Even the Duke of Manchester, in May 1776, conceded that, quote, "the Americans were greatly incensed against the king for giving orders to arm the Indian tribes against them and encouraging the black slaves to rise and cut the throats of their masters," unquote. Lord Dunmore's edict appeared in full in many British newspapers, and Parliament debated it. Although the point is, at times, lost sight of in the glow of rebel victory, the fact was that there was staunch opposition to secession in London. And for good anti-slavery reason. London may have misguided the virulence with which the colonists would view this edict, as suggested by a 1770s encounter in England, endured by Josiah Quincy of Massachusetts, who was admired by both John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. A quote-unquote Whig sympathizer observed how lucky it was that Quincy had come, since more than, quote, 2/3 at a time thought the Americans were all Negroes, unquote. Perhaps thinking North America was demographically akin to the Caribbean helped bolster the controversial edict. An angered Quincy, in turn, reverted to the now familiar and effective rallying cry of the rebels, replying that the majority in the Isles not only thought they were mostly Negroes, but also treated them as such, unquote. Lord Dunmore's proclamation should not have been viewed as overly shocking. Since Somerset's case, there had been a growing polarization, with some pro slavery militants beginning to develop ever more racially colored justifications for slavery in response to the insipid abolitionism. In early 1775, some anti-rebel advocates had anticipated Lord Dunmore by proposing an armed assault on the southern colonies, since Africans would instinctively back the redcoats, bringing a quick end to the conflict. Even Edmund Burke had mulled the explosive idea of general enfranchisement of the enslaved in order to reduce the South. Samuel Johnson had toasted the, quote, next insurrection of the Negroes in the West Indies and declared himself quite willing to love all men except an American, unquote. Earlier, he referred contemptuously to mainland settlers as a race of convicts who sought to convert Africans to Christianity in order to make them docile. Settlers in South Carolina and Georgia acknowledged in 1775 that if a mere 1,000 redcoats had landed in the latter province, and if their commander had handed out a few enticements to Africans, accompanied by a declaration of freedom for them, he would be instantly joined by 20,000 Africans, including those fleeing from South Carolina. All the while, colonists were grousing about being treated like slaves and yearning for succession. 1 second. Okay. Sorry about that. During the first week of December in 1775, rebels convened, and the white hot rhetoric flowed with passion about despotism, focused heavily on the edict. Lord Dunmore, it was said, was assuming powers which the king himself cannot exercise. Strategically, their first resolve chose to offer a pardon to those Africans who shall return to their duty, quote unquote, though it is unclear how many accepted this offer. Tactlessly, this was accompanied by another resolution promising death to those Africans who followed Lord Dunmore's wicked step, which excited our slaves to rebellion. Lord Dunmore had startled the insurgents, said Governor Thomas Gage in Boston, leaving him with few who were friends, and leaving the opposite party numerous, active, and violent. Plantations have been ravaged, claimed rebels in early 1776, at the behest of a lawless plundering soldierly and the more savage slave. With the wives and children stripped almost to nakedness, their very bedchambers invaded, as they were treated with every indignity. By March 1776, Lord Dunmore was, quote, endeavoring to raise 2 regiments here, one of white people, the other of black, unquote. He should not have been surprised to ascertain that recruitment of the former proceeded very slowly, while the latter proceeded very well. By April 1776, Major General Henry Clinton, a leading redcoat, was gloating alongside Cape Fear River about the, quote, 40 or 50 Negroes that had joined the forces. I have determined to form a company of them, he said. The rebel response was swift, retributive, and, as noted, angrily vengeful. Africans captured after fighting alongside redcoats were to be properly valued, then dispatched to the Caribbean or Central America, there to be sold, with the proceeds repaid to their respective owners, provided they are not unfriendly to American liberty. Quote unquote. And as we learned about like last chapter, right? There was a whole like section of British people at this time who were laughing and mocking the idea of an American liberty while they were fighting so hard to retain the slave trade, right? That was like a big theme that was going on in London at the time. And then the theme that we see emerging among the settlers is the idea that London is treating the settlers like slaves. But luckily for the rebels, many of Lord Dunmore's African forces were felled by smallpox. 9 or 10 of his black regiments every day, said one observer. A stunning 150 of these Negro forces had died within a short time, unquote, said one journalist. And the fact that other Africans were fleeing en masse to British lines could not compensate for the shortfall. It is pretty ridiculous, not gonna lie. American liberty still has slavery and apartheid. Like, okay, sure then. I don't think we want any of that liberty you're selling. Thank you very much. Oh, here we go. Thomas fucking Jefferson. In May 1776, Thomas Jefferson was informed that these shattered remnants of the Ethiopian regiment were still planning an attack. But now the prognosis for success was decidedly grim. In response, Lord Dunmore's detractors charged that in addition to speedily inoculating the blacks for the smallpox, his lordship also sent ashore affected wretches in order to spread the infection, but it was happily prevented, unquote. Lord Dunmore soldiered on, but depleted forces were not a prescription for strangling the infant of revolt in its cradle. The outbreak of smallpox arguably foiled the plan to deploy Africans to squash the settlers' rebellion. Thus, by June 1776, the British mariner A.S. Hammond acknowledged bluntly that, quote, Lord Dunmore and his fleet were in much danger from the enemy. But if there had been more healthy Africans, he boasted, I do not think it would be in the power of the rebels to dispossess us, unquote. But such was not to be, and by August the same Hammond was lamenting the sickly and weak state of the troops under Lord Dunmore's command, which doomed him to failure. If that were not enough, anti-London forces displayed remarkable unity, with Hammond marveling that, quote, not a single man of any sort of consideration left the rebels' ranks, unquote. He did not connect rebel cohesiveness directly to the November 1775 edict of Lord Dunmore. Intentionally or not, Lord Dunmore had poked a stick into a hornet's nest. One historian has observed that as early as 1760s in Virginia, it was likely that every white person in the eastern counties knew of a free person who had been killed by a slave. Thus, individual whites had nightmares about waking up amid slaves or feeling the first spasms of a stomach contorted by poison. Thus, they had just endured a remarkable spate of slave plots driven by the flux brought about by 7 Years' War. And now it was being suggested that Africans armed by the state were going to be unleashed. Colonists had endured actual poisonings by the enslaved, had to squash slave revolts instigated by Spaniards, and now confronted Africans armed by London. It is little wonder that the settlers rose as one to oust London's rule. Still, the rebels faced a real problem in launching war when so many within their ranks had counseled their for two policies that meant bringing more Africans to North America, thus hampering their chances of prevailing against London. Thus, by December 1775, George Washington had endured a change of heart and now was willing to allow Africans in his ranks, a policy switch that was blamed on the British. There was a class element in this reversal, however, in that free Negroes were to be allowed, not the enslaved. Still, giving settlers veritable phobia towards Africans of any sort, this was a breakthrough. However, as suggested by the aftermath of their victory, which led to the curtailment of the rights of even free Negroes, this was a temporary change of heart, at best, driven by the relentless exigency of the conflict. Apparently, when Washington arrived in Boston to confront the Redcoats, he was shocked to find so many armed Africans. And even during the dark days of early 1779, he resisted the policy of arming our slaves, unquote. Lord Dunmore had forced the hand of an outraged Washington and clearly influenced his reversal, as Africans too numerous to mention were in the process of fleeing to British lines. On the other hand, wittingly or not, London became identified with what one scholar has described as a race war and black supremacy, quote unquote, ideas which united settlers irreversible, as it complicated the post-war future of Africans insufficiently blessed to escape the charnel horse of North America that had been created to entrap them. The conclusion stressed by one perspicacious writer that the Negro was viewed as, quote, not an American, a permanent outlier, an eternal alien, should be viewed in this context. Weird how similar the way people's attitudes were, the same racist prejudice attitudes back then that we see today towards groups of people, huh? Literally, like, in your media. Washington was joined by Jefferson in reversing field in the heralded Declaration of Independence of 4th of July 1776, he sought to include language upbraiding the Crown for inciting enslaved Africans, but this incendiary language was stricken. Also, deep-sixed by Jefferson was language he described as reprobating the enslaving of Africans, but representatives of South Carolina and Georgia objected strenuously, though he admitted that, quote, our northern brethren, many of whom profited enormously from the slave trade, also dissented. They had been pretty considerable carriers of Africans to others, said the future president with accuracy. Like many Africans, the exiled Thomas Hutchinson, the last colonial governor of Massachusetts, found Jefferson's declaration to be the epitome of casuistry. I'm gonna look up this word. Process of reasoning that resolves moral problems. Casuistry. Casuistry. I wish you would read this to me. Oh wait, here we go. Casuistry. Casuistry. There we go. Casuistry. I got it now. Like many Africans, the exiled Thomas Hutchinson, the last colonial governor of Massachusetts, found Jefferson's declaration to be the epitome of casuistry. Thank you, Dr. Horne, for teaching us a new word. Casuistry. It's weird when you look it up, it doesn't take you to the dictionary, it takes you to Wikipedia. So a process of reasoning that seeks to resolve moral problems by extracting or extending abstract rules from a particular case, and reapplying those rules to new instances. This method occurs in applied ethics and jurisprudence. Okay. The term is also used pejoratively to criticize the use of clever but unsound reasoning, especially in relation to ethical questions. Okay, okay, interesting. Hey Dorian, welcome. So there you go. So it's the epitone of casusis for so yeah, I get it. Synonym for sophistry. Casuistry. You got it. If the rights enumerated were so absolutely inalienable, he asked curiously, how could the august delegates reconcile depriving so many Africans of their right to liberty? One astonished resident in Bristol, England, remarked after reading the declaration that, quote, one would imagine that the Parliament of Great Britain had treated the rebels with as great cruelty and as much injustice as they, the rebels, treat their Negro slaves. Unquote. As for the final member in the founding troika, John Adams, as the unveiling of Jefferson's handiwork approached, he was in intense dialogue about events in North Carolina, whose governor, Josiah Martin, was deemed to be Lord Dunmore's companion and perfidy. The future president's interlocutor informed him in April 1776 that this governor's reputed wicked maneuvers had totally charged the temper and the disposition of the inhabitants that are friends to liberty, meaning rebels. Support for the crown virtually disintegrated. A total separation is what they want, Adams was told. Independence is the word most used, with, in many countries, not one dissenting voice. Adams found this to be very encouraging, as he renounced the baseness and cruelty of his correspondent's enemies and embraced the wisdom, virtue, and valor of North Carolina. In June 1775, that the feasibility of neutering London's advantage among Africans by taking abolitionist steps was recommended to Adams, though worry was expressed that this could simultaneously wreck the rebel cause among the all-important slaving lobby. Thus, this step was to prove to be a bridge too far for all concerned. This also indicates why observers should view with skeptical restraint the crassly pragmatic post 1776 attempt by rebels to recruit and assuage Africans, as suggested by Washington's overtures to free Negroes, a solicitude that virtually disintegrated on cue after London was ousted from the 13 colonies. Adams was a savvy politician in that he was able to ride the wave generated by Governor Martin, though Africans were the losers in almost every respect. Echoing the perverse motto of the era, it was Adams who bluntly informed the Crown that the settlers, quote, won't be their London's Negroes, unquote. Yet the dilemma of the settlers there was exposed when it was revealed that within months, the Governor Martin's perceived perfidy, enslaved Africans were still pouring into the colony from abroad. Governor Martin was accused by his opponents of arming the slaves against their masters, and they advised that this claim be published as an alarm to their people about the horrid and barbarous designs of the enemies. Unquote. Governor Martin was outraged by the assertions falsely imputed to him, though by this point he lost credibility with his supposed constituency. By April 1776, what Governor Martin allegedly had proposed had been transformed into the more expansive proposal that, quote, governors in different colonies have declared protection to slaves who should imbrue their hands in the blood of their masters, unquote. Unfortunately for Martin, Africans in North Carolina were in the process of rebelling, which was the problem with rebutting the idea that they were aligned with London. For once this latter idea took off, it became captive to the plans of unruly Africans who did not necessarily coordinate closely with the crown, but whose plans were ascribed to London nonetheless. Just as settlers earlier had pointed to the supposed ubiquitous hand of Madrid in explicating African rebelliousness, which had the advantage of evading responsibility for their own awful maltreatment of slaves. With their armed revolt against His Majesty, it was now the ubiquitous hand of London that was the despised culprit. Again, does this sound familiar to the wild assertions that we're seeing today of Chinese and Russian interfering with our elections and our media? I wonder if there's a similar ideological foundation. They certainly sound similar, don't they? For Governor Martin's denials seemed hollow when, in July 1775, an intended Negro insurrection was uncovered in his backyard. A revolt bent on destroying the inhabitants of this province without respect to age or sex. Reputedly, the combatants were to be armed by the state and, said rebel leadership, settled in a free government of their own. Ooh, spooky for this whites. Reportedly, considerable ammunition was found among those formulating this accursed plan, designed to make settlers easy prey. Thus, by July 1775, one settler in this colony seemed on the verge of a nervous collapse. "Sound the alarm!" cried John Simpson. That was a number of Africans said to be instigated by the crown to revolt had secreted themselves in a fort near New Bern. Did not aid London's cause. Once more, there was a contagion at play, for in the months leading up to July 1776, there were various disturbances and alarms among the enslaved in Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York, which alarmed and dismayed settlers accordingly. Increasingly, the bill of indictment against London was the perception that it had aligned with Africans against the settlers, confirming the calcified bias of those who had long held the conception of perfidious Albion, not least in South Carolina, where the long-standing African majority had kept colonists on edge. Gabriel Manigault, a leading member of a leading family in the future Palmetto state, seemingly seeking to reassure himself as much as others, asserted in September 1775 that there was, quote, not so much reason to be afraid of the Negroes as was first suspected, unquote. But, understandably, this was hardly a unanimous opinion. A keener indication of the trend that eventuated during the war emerged when George Washington was told in 1776 that in Charleston, redcoats were quite deftly and successfully encouraging our slaves to desert to them. Others in Charleston were stunned by the curious fact that during this time of tumult, quote, Negroes were engaged with white persons in wholesale robbery, reminiscent of a role often played by colonists. Pirates. So, as the new year of 1776 was unfolding, a panicked rebel leadership found that a determined force of runaway Africans had gathered on Sullivan's Island, hard by what is now Charleston, to harass the Patriot War effort, allegedly in conjunction with British warships. For London and the Africans, this was a double-edged sword, associating the former with the horrors of Negro revolt while associating the latter with resistance to what was coming to be seen as a sacred cause. Suppressing African resistance became a crucial component of forging settler unity, and the solidifying identity that was whiteness which cut prodigiously along religious, ethnic, class, and gender lines. The forging of settled unity and the congealing identity that was whiteness also consolidated the developing connection between settlers' fear of alleged British enslavement, their own possession of Africans as chattel, and the fear that the relationship between master and slave could be reversed to their crushing detriment. Again, these perceptions did not arise in a vacuum, but were bolstered by the preceding decades of intense insecurity, often brought by the Africans aided by the external forces, the Catholic powers, quote unquote, and then London, almost effortlessly assuming this villain's role. Though the Charleston elite had good reason to suspect that bringing more Africans to their vicinity was immiscible to their prospects for a victorious anti-London revolt, the enslaved kept arriving nonetheless. Months before the Declaration of Independence, the Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia, forbade slave importations into any of the 13 United Colonies, which was wise since many of these Africans could be converted into redcoats. But this measure proved difficult to enforce, given perceived production needs and skillful smuggling talents. Enslaved Africans continued to arrive in the colonies regularly, as the rebels continued to natter on about liberty. And as evidenced by the thwarting of Jefferson's words to rebuff this trend, powerful interests seemed to envision no alternative to this mortal danger. More Africans were arriving and being implanted in fertile soil that associated their presence with an increasingly discredited foe in London, though evidently their presence was deemed necessary nonetheless. These contradictory strains were creating a symbiotic loathing and reliance upon Africans, with murderous surveillance deemed necessary to ensure they were at all times under control, a trend that did not necessarily abate in the founding of the new republic. In addition, the continued importation of this problem people was costing hundreds of thousands of pounds sterling, driving a portion of the colony's elite into debt. Though this was understandably viewed as necessary for the economy, it was also the equivalent of continued importation of potential enemies. On the other hand, the slave trade had to be reconfigured, since relying upon Liverpool and Bristol was made more difficult by war. Why should human traffickers in Britain send slave labor to those who were rebelling against the crown? Moreover, rebelling against foreign creditors can at times make smart business sense, particularly if you can outgun them. That the embattled settlers ultimately succeeded in ousting the British from the astronomically lucrative slave trade indicated they were astute assessors of a prime factor in developing capitalism: risk. Samuel Johnson may have had this issue in mind when he claimed that the rebels' revolt was driven in part by associations of fraud to rob their creditors, quote unquote. As he saw it, meritorious method defined their rebellion in that they boasted of their, quote, contributions to the last war, a war incited by their outcries and continued for their protection, a war by which none but themselves were gainers, unquote, but which they did not want to pay for in taxes. Above all, he was flabbergasted by their constant prating about liberty while continuing the enslavement of tens and thousands. Quote, "How is it that we can hear the loudest yelps of liberty among the drivers of Negroes?" Unquote, he asked mischievously, in words that could only deepen the schism with the rebels. In 1775, he counseled abolition of slavery and added, none too diplomatically, about the Africans. Quote, if they are furnished with firearms for defense and utensils for husbandry, and settled in some simple form of government within the country, they may be more grateful and honest than their masters. Unquote. Arm the Africans and indigenes to combat the rebels, he declaimed. Naturally, Johnson was rebuked sharply by the rebels and their supporters, with denunciation of Lord Mansfield, also included for good pro-slavery measure. The country that my people are from, Mauritius, was a slave-holding port because of its proximity to Africa. The island was empty otherwise. When the slave trade ended, 20,000 slaves were let go on the island, but the British came back and marginalized them to the point of most people not even knowing they existed. This erasure happens to this day in the name of promoting white tourism and not making white people feel guilty. Yep, Nabil. And, you know, the thing is, the funny thing is, like, the book that Midwestern Marx, like, wrote, which is called Purity Fetish, whatever the fuck it is, literally is a response to this book that we're reading right here. It's literally a bunch of quote unquote white leftists. They're not really leftists at all, they're fascists, right? But these white communists, supposedly, who are so upset that Gearld Horne pointed out that Gearld Horne pointed out that that 1776 was actually a counter-revolution. They feel like that is why they wrote the Purity Fetish book, because they feel like their position or their argument is that teaching people the truth about how 1776 actually represents a step back for humanity was actually not a progress for the majority of people all over the world. They think that that is inciting defeatism and is counter-revolutionary. And my response to that, as I've said many times before, is always, how can you think so little of the people? How can you have such a low opinion of people that you think that you can't tell them the truth? That they can't understand the truth of, like, how the founding of America, how 1776 was a counter-revolution, right? Like, teaching people that is not defeatism, and, like, how can you think that they can't grasp that? And, you know, instead, no, we gotta keep going with the bourgeois narrative about 1776 being a revolution in order to build revolution in the US. Like, that is nonsense. We don't want to deceive the people. Fucking communists disdain to conceal their aims. Yeah, it's written by Carlos Guerrero. But I mean, that's what it's all about. And if you even in the back, there's like a whole like section about responding to this Gearld Horne book in particular. It's wild. Like, these are the communists. Which is why, like, when I first encountered Midwestern Marx, it was actually just Eddie and someone else. I think it might have been Carlito in a discussion, and I noticed then that they were like anti-native liberation. Oh yeah. Well, like I said, I noticed way back then they were anti-liberation, and I've been basically, it is mainly those two people. They have, like, their board of directors is this other guy though. Some, like, old white dude with PhD. They all have, like, university degrees and shit. It's a sus org altogether to me. But, you know, maybe I'm I'm biased coming from my perspective. Who knows? But they are fascists. That much is guaranteed. They literally do the fascist tactic of, they want to deny the need for liberation here. They deny ongoing colonial settler genocide, and no, actually, so Midwestern Marx is like this fucking institute. Like, look here. I hate searching for this, but I'll show you. See, Midwestern Marx is this institute. The American Communist Party is supposedly something that they made afterwards. Uh, 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 is that Roderick Day? Dorian, do you know? So it's like a think tank. And supposedly, like the way, and see, this is their institute board. This is the guy I'm talking about, Thomas Riggins. He's the counseling director. Carlos Gearld, he's the one who wrote that book right here, Purity Fetish. This book. See? Where is it? I have the actual thing. I actually have the ebook for it somewhere, but this is it right here. See? Purity Fetish and the Crisis of Western Marxism. This is the book that argues again, that basically argues that the Gerald Horne's correct conclusion that 1776 wasn't a revolution, but was actually a counter-revolution to retain slavery and expanding manifest destiny is actually wrong and an example of purity fetish, supposedly. All of this shit is like, yeah. Their whole, and then there's Eddie, and then there's Noah. I've had the displeasure of speaking with all of them. And then these people got together with Jackson Hinkle, some reactionaries that were part of the Communist Party USA, and people from that other one, Party Communist USA, PC USA, got together with a bunch of these people and decided that they declared that the Communist Party USA is defunct and that the American Communist Party is the rebranding of the Communist Party USA. So ACP is technically not even the founding of a new party. It is the declaration of them being the legitimate Communist Party USA. Like straight up fascist playbook tactics, right? Like you try and take the name of an already like existing communist party or try and like co-opt it, and then the first thing they did is like go out and sign all of these weird agreements with like they went to the Communist Party of Georgia, they went to the Communist Party of Venezuela, they went to the Communist Party of Russia, and like signed all of these agreements before they even do any building at home, like so that they can then turn around and say we're the actual Communist Party USA. I'm literally so glad I asked Larry about Carlito's book. Save me catching a bullet. Yeah, I I I've been going again. I've been talking about how Midwestern Marx is fucking reactionary for close to a decade now. So it's just funny when someone accuses me of being in that group. Hey, Elron, welcome. All right, let's continue. The heck? Weird beep. A London parliamentarian has suggested that if the settler revolt was successful, and the then profitable relationship between the Caribbean and the mainland would be disrupted, meaning the inevitable ruin of the former, thereby jeopardizing the slave trade and slavery. This was prescient in a sense, for it is striking that after the revolt succeeded and Republicans surged to leadership in capturing the slave trade, abolition deepened its hold on London, which led inexorably to the destruction of slavery in the Caribbean. When the Republic was established, slave traders there, coincidentally enough, assumed control over one of the most important markets for the enslaved, that is, the mainland, which could then be leveraged for expansion into allied markets in Cuba, Brazil, and elsewhere. not to mention North America itself, while London was left with mostly small Caribbean islands. By the early 1790s, Republicans held a majority position in supplying Africans to Havana, placing them far ahead of those who had been their leaders. Madrid and London. This development explicitly rebuked the irksome 1762 Declaration of London concerning Cuba that had circumscribed the mainlanders' participation in what was to become a deliciously profitable trade in human flesh. I was actually in an Eddie Liger stream once before I knew who he was, and I listened to him go on and on about his version of communism. And when I asked him where people of color, women, queer people, disabled fit into his model, he banned me. Yep. You know what's. Okay, before I continue to read again, I just want to say, you know what's funny about people accusing me of being all supposedly pro blood quantum? Is the last person who accused me of being pro blood quantum was when I pointed out about the ongoing native genocide to Eddie. And Eddie goes, we can't. How are we going to determine who's legitimate, who's a settler and who's a native by using blood quantum? You just love blood quantum, and started posting about how much I love blood quantum. Eddie did. Said I was anti-immigrant and I loved blood quantum because I was just being like, hey, how come your analysis doesn't include native people, and how come you're like none of your work even has like any mention of ongoing native genocide and settler colonialism. That just came to my head when I read your thing, Nabil. Like, yeah, the last time somebody said that to me about me being supportive of fucking blood quantum was Eddie Liger. Damn. Because his thing was, I guess his thing was like, oh, I'm just a first generation immigrant, so I can't be stealing land. This also carried implication for Cuba's neighborhood. In 1770, there were about 250,000 Africans in Hispaniola, and by 1790, this figure had doubled. What needs to be considered in this context, as well as the extent to which Euro American slave dealers provided the demographic imbalance, had led to the Haitian Revolution. Gentry was the war's clear victory, says one perceptive historian of the eruption in Virginia that led to the founding of the US. He could well have added the overlapping but distinct category of slave traders. Oh my god, I saw that, Nabil. The thirst trap. Oh, yeah, I saw that. And he's like wearing the gray sweatpants and shit. I mean, I laugh because it's the same look. Okay, then we'll finish the read, okay? I'm sorry, you're all giving me too much juicy shit. But just look at this. Even this, right? We've got we've got like everybody's pictures here on their on their board of like directors and contributors. Look at all their pictures, right? Look. Hey Christina. Okay? Right? You know? And then and then look at Eddie's picture. Like, it's true. White people. Is this because white people have no culture? Is that what's going on? I don't know. I'm guessing. I keep hearing this like boop boop. Okay, anyway, I think we're on the last page here. Other than Virginia, South Carolina had a major problem in launching an anti London revolt, while worrying that its chances could be snuffed out easily by rebellion of the enslaved. As in North Carolina, the border with Georgia was also afire, with the rumor that leading royal officials were plotting to ensure that slaves would become masters and masters would become slaves. The nightmare of whites everywhere. A rumor giving weight by the controversies involving Lord Dunmore and Governor Martin. No, I'm like genuinely wondering what the fuck happened. I will find out where this is coming from. It's holy crap. I'm a little scared too, Cinnamon. I keep hearing this beep. It's like boop boop. A rumor given weight by controversies involving Lord Dunmore and Governor Martin. John Stuart, London's man in St. Augustine, dismissed this notion, although his very residence echoed memories of a time when organizing Africans to attack settlers was par for the course. Oh god. I hate when I do that. He admitted that nothing can be more alarming to the Carolinians than arming Africans, while conceding the instrumental nature of such a claim in that its reputation meant that leaders of the dissatisfied parties easily carried into execution their plans of arming the people, meaning settlers instead. Stuart's residence in Florida may have given him a warped view, for this province was the dog that didn't bark, though it was under London's rule, like those 13 to the north. Why did Florida not join the secessionists? Redisby, I got something for you as soon as we're done. Arguably, the legacy of Spanish Florida had not dissipated. That is, the presence of a corps of armed Africans, and what had become an industry of annoying Georgia by providing refuge to escaping Africans. Still, there was worriment about arming Africans to confront rebels, though this was hardly avoidable. Moreover, Seminoles and Creeks had pledged to back the crown. As things turned out, scores of armed Africans prevented the defection of Florida. It is possible, too, that anti-Catholicism also hampered the attempt by the rebels to triumph in Florida, a factor that may explicate the failure to bark of another conspicuously silent canine, perpetually restive Quebec, still smarting over perceived Anglo domination to this very day. It's true! Damn, Gearld Horne is fucking a deliciously delightful writer. Perpetually restive Quebec, still smarting over perceived Anglo domination to this very day. Dang, that fucking hits hard, doesn't it? That's wild because, like, even the so-called the Communist Party of Canada could not have a Communist Party of Canada without Quebec having its own individual fucking party. And you can even like it's hilarious. Like you can even go and talk to Quebec today and they will swear up and down that they were that Quebec was that Quebec is still like that Quebec is this oppressed nationality. It's wild. Hilariously wild. Were they commonly called Africans back then? I mean, all different names. Whiteness was emerging, so they were being called black and stuff, among other things. A century earlier, in the aftermath of Bacon's rebellion, elites had accelerated the development of race and religion to sanctify rule through whiteness. But Florida and Quebec suggested that by 1776, this remained a work in progress. Yeah, I'm not Canadian, I'm Quebecois. Whatever the case, weeks after 4th of July 1776, Africans were flooding into St. Augustine from Georgia and the Carolinas in a replay of what had occurred when Madrid was in control of this strategically sited port. Simultaneously, with the pressure eased on the front, British officialdom was able to dispatch forces from St. Augustine to Virginia, a force that likely included Africans. For, as one rebel noted at that time, the presence of these redcoats had brought exceeding bad effects among the blacks. Same, Nabil. Same. That and Acadians. And like, look, Acadians, they were even allies, like, in many respects, but goddamn, they're the ones who most often are white people claiming Mi'kmaq indigeneity with no right to do so. Or as the recent thing is now, Eastland Woodland Métis. If you wanted to hear a cursed ass fucking title, there you go. For a year after these words had been uttered, rebel leadership in Georgia spoke nervously about the British troops in St. Augustine and what that portended for the vast numbers of Negroes there, who were sufficient to subdue them. In point of number of blacks exceed the whites, and the ready channel of supply and secure retreat which St. Augustine affords render them much to be dreaded. Also, hampering London's response was a factor that should have been anticipated. A factor that had caused the Crown to retrench to the mainland in the first place. Africans in Jamaica were on the warpath, necessitating the dispatching of troops that could have been helpful in smashing the rebels' revolt. At a crucial moment in 1776, when London needed to concentrate its forces on the mainland, Sir Basil Keith, the governor, was alarmed by the amazing and dangerous disproportion of the slaves there, which merited immediate attention. Thus, weeks after Jefferson's declaration, Vice Admiral Clark Gayton of the Crown's forces confessed that mariners had to be diverted to suppress a general insurrection of Negroes, forcing martial law, and mandating that a flotilla be kept in the Caribbean, instead of heading northward, for the safety of Jamaica. This was deemed prudent since the rebellion there was to have been general throughout the island. Seemingly pleased, one mainland periodical reported breathlessly that in Jamaica, provisions have become very scarce since the Negroes had actually rose and cut off several plantations. Derided were the humane butchers of Britain, who in 1772 had ordered forces redeployed from the island to the mainland in order to cut mainland settlers' throats, and were now reaping the whirlwind. So sorry to interrupt this reading. Iran just launched 120 ballistic missiles at Israel. Holy shit. Missiles or rockets? Do we know if they're guided or not? Just curious. I mean, so I wonder now that they're... Here's the thing. Let's take bets. Now that the resistance has retaliated, do you think that now Amy is going to... And our other whites are going to now declare this to be a regional war? I keep saying, like, I find it hilariously ridiculous. I find it ridiculously hilarious that so many will be like, oh, but we're risking regional war. We're risking regional war. It's like, what the fuck? That's such a settler, like, that's such a colonial-centric outlook, because at the end of the day, regional war was declared when Israel set up shop and fucking carved out this area in West Asia. That's when war was declared, and every day since then has been war and a genocidal campaign against not just Palestinians, but against any Arab people, whether they're in Palestine, and not just whether they're in Palestine, whether they're Muslim or Christian or Jewish, whatever the fuck. It don't matter if they're in Lebanon, Yemen, fucking Syria. There's been a regional war since, right? And I would estimate that with British and American warplanes bombing Yemen fucking almost a year ago now, months and months ago, that we in fact could say that it's more like a world war. What else do you call it when Britain flies to fucking West Asia and starts bombing on behalf of Israel? If that's not a world fucking conflict, what am I missing exactly? Because they're not officially declared war, the US is always on a war ready footing. So how could that be? You know? The US is always ready for war. It's been perpetually ready for war. Being as generous as possible to that crowd, the regional war opened in 1967. Yep. Absolutely. Majority seems to be targeted towards Tel Aviv. Hey, Telestraka. The thing we have to remember though, like when they're targeting Tel Aviv, unlike in Gaza, unlike Hamas, Israel actually does put its military assets in civilian, quote unquote, civilian areas. I mean, you know my position there. Why is our bitrate just tanking? That's so ridiculous. God, I'm tired of my stream having such horrible bitrate all the time. I'm gonna have to call my internet like provider or something. Sputnik on Twitter has a thread. Okay. God, this beeping is like driving me. I'm gonna bring this remote over here so I can try and figure out if it's this beeping at me. I think it might be this. And leave it there. Thank you, Almec. IDF says Iran fired missiles towards Israel. IOF, that is. Tel Aviv. Uh-oh. I gotta be careful. I might be seen as a Russian asset if I'm looking at Sputnik. You never know. I'm not even joking, though. You look at this news, you could be accused of being a Russian agent. And we know leftist news sources like Some More News isn't gonna come and help you. Footage allegedly showing the sky over the Iranian capital of Tehran. Here we go. And Yemen said that they are going to step up their resistance as well. That's what I'm wondering, if it's beeping because it needs batteries, Cinnamon. I'm gonna keep it over here and listen to it. God, my bit rate is like, what the heck? We know there are eyes here looking to report any possible misinterpretation they can. Yeah, I mean, that's fine. Because I've heard people say that they're gonna that there's going to be a compilation of me made talking about how I'm or showing how I'm opportunistic for saying that you need to report resistance and liberation struggle against colonialism and imperialism, regardless of whether or not it's anti-capitalist enough or anarchist enough or Marxist enough. And that's fine because I stick by that statement, and I have for a very long time. Of course, Russia's the first one reporting on it. Russian media. The West is trying to figure out how to spin this still into an anti-resistance story. Okay, we're like... I think we're almost at the end of this, yeah. Sounds like someone is gonna post your greatest hits for free then. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I really don't mind. I really don't mind that. They did the same thing when they said about my, like, critiques of anarchism. And we looked at it and it was like, okay, this is all pretty base, though. Okay, where the fuck was I? Oh, right here. Alright, let's finish this read and then we'll do our news and we'll have lots to talk about there. Certain folks just like to use the one true Scotsman approach. Dogmatic approaches to communism is antithetical to dialectical materialism. Oh, you better be careful, Almac. That's getting you're sounding like you might support Juche there. Creativity in Marxism? Uh-oh. Okay. I owe somebody a quote. And this is my favorite quote pertaining to Juche. So we're gonna read this quote, and then we'll finish up this read. Okay? And then we'll do the news for the day. This is the last chapter, so... But look, you gotta see this. I love this fucking quote right here. Cinnamon knows the quote. I love this quote, and this is Huey Newton. This is sort of like after, like, there's a period of struggle in the Black Panther Party where some are really talking Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, and others are talking sort of Juche. Oh, I figured out it's this headset. There we go. God, shut the hell up. There. So, this is sort of after that they've decided on Juche, right? And so here's what he says. Sort of declaring themselves to be followers of the Juche method. And I'll show you, there's another cool thing that the Panthers themselves wrote about Juche. I'll see if I can dig it up. The Black Panther Party is a Marxist-Leninist party because we follow the dialectical method, and we also integrate theory with practice. We are not mechanical Marxists, and we are not historical materialists. Some people think they are Marxists when actually they are following the thoughts of Hegel. Some people think they are Marxist-Leninists, but they refuse to be creative, and are therefore tied to the past. They're tied to a rhetoric that does not apply to the present set of conditions. They're tied to a set of thoughts that approaches dogma, what we call flunkyism. And of course, flunkyism is the term that is really, like, used in Juche and by Kim Jong-il to explain this tendency of Marxist-Leninists to basically use existing theories and try to apply them carbon copy, right? And this is why Marx of the Beast, right? I need to watch all of your Juche videos. I still don't know enough. I've kind of fallen more under Marxist-Leninist Maoist tendencies, but I don't know. I'm just a dude that wants the world to be better. And Marx of the Beast, this is like, for me, this is why when I when I first started, like I started studying Juche years and years ago, along with Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, bunch of other. I studied a lot of the work, Fanon, and all of this stuff. And reading Juche, I came to realize that, like, the problem, like, I'm of course in agreement and basically aligned with Marxist Leninists completely, but I decided to sort of like just call myself a communist. And whatever specific theory emerges here that is relative to our conditions, I will call myself that when it happens, right? I like prefer to just say communist because I felt like when I was saying Marxist Leninist, it was like I would have to explain all my positions anyway, right? So that's why once I read Juche, I was like, okay, wait a second. I'm realizing now that like Marxist Leninist kind of, at least in my own personal where I work IRL, it's like saying that sort of like leaves people with this impression, this pre-impression, this, right? So I found that since I'm explaining my positions and shit anyway, I was better off just saying I'm a communist and then saying what my positions are. And most people who are Juche followers, of course, like the main thing about Juche is creativity in the movement. Is that you can't determine your revolution based on like existing theories and shit. That the main criteria for your revolution must be the actual conditions, the actual things that pertain to your revolutionary struggle. And Juche goes on further to say, of course, that it is possible for socialism and communism to be built by people who have never studied Marx or Lenin. Because because socialism is a science. And the people, the masses, they inherently want to build a world that is a socialist world. It's that reactionaries, by the very definition of what reactionary means, try to stop that progress from happening. Therefore, it is wrong to sort of impose that these people or that people have to follow Marxism, Leninism in order to be communists, right? That they can build it based on their own experiences. And that's kind of the same thing that I'm always saying about like native people. Like they don't have to study Marx and Lenin and stuff to build a successful, scientifically socialist thing. I love this quote too. Why should we be misunderstood by others that we are advocating nationalism when we created the wonderful Juche idea of universal importance that has inherited and developed the progressive ideologies of mankind? It is wrong to think that only natural sciences have continuity in their development. Social sciences and philosophical thoughts also develop continuously. We should always consider all things and phenomena from the viewpoint of development. All things have two aspects: inheritance and innovation. To observe only one aspect is a metaphysical viewpoint. And so when we talk about Juche being an original revolutionary philosophy, that's a good thing, right? There's inheritance and there's innovation. And when we say Juche is an original philosophy, that doesn't mean you throw out Marxism Leninism. It means that if you study Marxism Leninism and you study Juche, you will have a better understanding of both. And you'll have a better understanding of socialist society and capitalist society and all of these other things because it incorporates like all of these theories. It's not just socialism with Korean characteristics. That's a fucking mistake that people made. It's the first philosophy to ever emerge that explains the developing of socialist society itself. Maoism and Marxism, Leninism, Maoism started sort of down this road, but China uh, and you know, I'm a staunch defender of China, but we have to understand that revolution is a transitional stage, which means some revolutions are going to be at different stages than others. And like I always say, because of particular conditions in Korea, including a genocidal war that was brought upon them, including some of its history, Korea's revolution advanced very rapidly. The bourgeoisie was quickly expropriated, private property was quickly abolished, the socialist system was fully established, and now they have 1 year plan, 7 year plans. You're not going to see a reform and opening up in DPRK because they went beyond that stage already using a different strategy. So Juche emerges not in order to understand how to build socialism in Korea necessarily, but how to protect socialism and consolidate it to that higher stage of communism. And that is one reason why I think Juche is so important, because it examines history not just from a lens of historical materialism, although it recognizes the benefits and the importance of historical materialism. It uses that as a premise and instead examines things from a human-centered perspective. And the benefit of this is that it can help explain things when the form of class struggle changes in a socialist society, when the majority of people have state power in their hands, and also can help explain conditions before class struggle emerged. What is the ideological, like, the source of the ideological source of, like, that class emergence, right? It was a human drive for independence, and then reactionaries emerging in that human drive for independence from that which fettered them. And in the case of, like, where colonialism and settler colonialism emerged in Europe and in Western Europe, like, you had this drive for independence, for whatever reason, caused some uneven development that then led to certain people taking this reactionary position that led to class cleavages that, of course, we're still dealing the reverberations of. And then that sort of class-based society was exported to places all over the place as they look for new markets. Some of it Marx refers to as primitive accumulation. Most people I talk to are basically radical socialists. If I just bring up one way the system fucks them over, but they never use the term socialist. Yep, exactly. And that's why, again, like, I do like Kim Jong Il's education method, which is to focus on like positivity. Of course, we're gonna have to point out the negatives and talk about the negatives too. But the more you can focus on, like, a positive transformation campaign and positive examples, that really inspires people, right? So you say one way things are fucking them over, or it's like, hey, imagine if we had universal healthcare, or we had this or that, right? And then, like I say, another, like, an example of doing positive examples and sort of combining that with revolutionary education is, like, a good strategy of building dual power is to, like, meet people where they need, if they need food, if they need healthcare, and then combining that with the revolutionary education. It's absurd to read only one very basic set of ideas and say, I'm good, all reading, thinking about that now, I'm an expert. Yep. Or to read what somebody has said about a thing like Juche and think that you know everything about it, or think that you can determine whether it's, you know, whether it qualifies as a counter-revolutionary thing or not. It's like, maybe no investigation, no right to speak. Anyway, sorry for that sidetrack. Let's finish up this work. I'm on page 244. We're almost there. We're almost there. Ironically, a mainland revolt driven in no small part by opposition to abolition and perceived friendliness of the crown to the Africans was aided immeasurably by a revolt against the crown by Africans. Ironically still, Just before the Africans revolted, the elite in Jamaica, not unlike their mainland counterparts, were complaining bitterly about taxes imposed upon the importation of the enslaved, though these imposts may have saved their lives. It's the reason you'll hear annoying people say the USSR was state capitalist and stuff. Oh, don't even get me started. Or deformed worker state. The DPRK is a deformed worker state. God damn, my bitrate's going down to 0 sometimes. God damn it. Yeah, I know. My fucking internet's like gone right to hell all of a sudden for some reason. God damn. Hold on one sec, just sending a message. God damn. Yeah, I bet I'm freezing for several seconds. My internet speed is like, what the fuck? Like I fucking half wonder if I'm like getting DDoSed all the time or something, because I fucking constantly have this happen. As soon as midday comes, my internet goes right to shit. It's fucking wild. Every single time, about the same time every day, right around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. For a good deal of the post 1776 conflict, look down in double digits again. Okay, hopefully you can all see me still. My internet's really fucking shit for some reason. For a good deal of the post 1776 conflict with the rebels, London had to monitor carefully the unruliness of the Africans in the Caribbean. Not least, their combining with their counterparts in what was to become Haiti, which hindered the ability to suppress the rebels. At the same time, London was becoming increasingly dependent on Africans. But because of the demographic imbalance, racially in its colonies, the crown was being forced in a direction contrary to that of the rebels. With Paris aiding the rebels, London was rebuffed when it turned to France, with a proposal to form a cartel against the Africans, thereby compelling the crown to pursue few options beyond working out of an entente with the Negroes. Right? Like, just a frame, please. Discord when I got a moment? Okay, will do. We're struggling to stay on the internet. That we got that Megama internet here. Yeah. No, March, that is exactly what's happening. I've said that before. That is exactly what's happening here. Good, I'm glad the audio's still working. But yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's common in my in these areas. Resternet. There were many ups and downs on the road to formation of the new republic, but the die was cast in Somerset's case and Lord Dunmore's edict, and the decades of history that undergirded both, as the rebels cut deals with the once derided Catholic powers, especially France. The crown's destiny was sealed. In a sense, London was lucky to escape with Canada. Yet, all of the years in which London complained about settlers' trade with Paris and Madrid was an ironic premonition of what such commerce would lead to in the post-1776 era. What one insightful historian has defined as a white settler revolt and the White American War of Independence was triumphant. Thelma Wills Foote added that for many Africans, it was their relocation to the British side, not the long march to victory in the US. That meant moving from slavery to freedom. For the upshot of the triumph of 1776, she says, brought about the reassertion of slave owner control over the enslaved black population in the new republic. How many Africans fought on the wrong or losing side is open to debate. Though it is evident that, for the most part, and understandably, Africans did not see their best interests vindicated by the establishment of the republic. When the import of Somerset's case was extended to Scotland in 1778 and expanded, the precipitary of these Africans was vindicated further. According to one commentator, enslaved Africans on the mainland secretly wished the British Army might win, for then all Negro slaves would gain their freedom. It is said that sentiment is universal amongst all the Negroes in America, unquote. And this pro-London sentiment continued virtually until the surrender of the forces of Robert E. Lee, distinguished scion of the founding family who thought he was simply solidifying their legacy. Thus, the Connecticut legislature was not atypical in never demanding that masters free their slaves who fought in the anti-London revolt. Delegates at the first Constitutional Convention in the state of New York deemed it to be highly inexpedient to debate slavery. At the Constitutional Convention that encompassed the states, it was future President James Madison who argued that the still bothersome Somerset's case necessitated that the U.S. Constitution include a rigorous clause mandating the return of enslaved fugitives, a policy that irradiated relations between the republics and the crown for decades to come. Both sides, but particularly the crown, fighting thousands of miles away from headquarters, found that African soldiers often were more disciplined than others, perhaps because they had more at stake. Few Africans, unlike Europeans, had farms to tend during the harvest season, a time when the desertion rate among those with this obligation soared. As London discovered when it was conscripting forces for Havana and Cartagena years earlier. Few Africans had Africans to monitor on said farms either, making it easier for them to focus on the tasks at hand. Few Europeans had to worry about being sold into slavery if captured on the battlefield. Whoa, Cinnamon, you just fished up Stalin's resignation letter. Hell yeah. See, it's only rare because there's so many of them. Those with such troublesome property had further reason to despise London, when after the revolt's success, the crown refused to compensate numerous Republican slaveholders after their Africans fled. According to one account, about 20,000 enslaved Africans joined the Redcoats, roughly the same number of European loyalists who joined regiments, which does not account for free Negroes who acted similarly. Among the latter was Benjamin Whitcuff, a free Negro from Long Island, who joined the Redcoats early on and spied for nearly 2 years. Before the rebels caught him and hung him, though British troops arrived minutes after the rope was tightened, cut him down, and saved his life. He was joined in his pro-London crusade by an unnamed Negro who participated in a plot to kidnap George Washington. Another free Negro, Samuel Burke, claimed that he personally slew 10 rebels in one battle in North Carolina. Let's go! Hey Jay, I'm glad you all like that. You throw that back into the lake. Stalin isn't allowed to resign. I mean, they didn't let him. The presence of so many enslaved Africans handicapped the rebels, particularly in South Carolina. In March 1779, a theme was sounded at the Continental Congress that was to resound throughout this conflict. Carolinians, it was reported, were, quote, unable to make any effectual efforts with militia, by reason of the great proportion of citizens necessary to remain at home to prevent insurrections among the Negroes and prevent the desertion of them to the enemy, because great numbers of the Africans were susceptible either to revolt or to desert. Rebels defensively and explicitly in the crude practicality that became their hallmark sought to form their own Negro regiment, if only to lessen the danger from revolts and desertions by detaching the most vigorous and enterprising from among the Negroes. That same year, 1779, a French diplomat captured the dilemma of rebels and ultimately why the Africans were to suffer so grievously for decades to come. The Africans, he said, repeating a phrase that had become tellingly common, quote, are the intestine enemies of this colony, he opined. But the number of white men is too small in proportion to raise an outcry against the emancipation proposal by the English. It appeared that the repudiation of the crown by the rebels had evoked the patriotic temper of the British, while causing them to cast a jaundiced eye upon the repudiators. Noted writer and anti-slavery advocate Thomas Day captured this mood when he proclaimed that slavery was a crime so monstrous against the human species that all those who practice it deserve to be extirpated from the earth. Unquote. Even today, there are those in the Isles who have refused to accept the glorious narrative that encapsulates the rebels' revolt in the U.S. Charles Hazel of Tipperary, Ireland, recently pointed to the Royal Proclamation of 1763 as the ignition for rebellion in 1776, since it expressly forbade land ownership and settlement beyond the line of the Appalachian Mountains, which was to, quote, be reserved for Indian country, but which the settlers desired, along with the generous stocking of slaves. Quote, for some colonials, he said, this was hard to stomach, a lengthening list that included George Washington. The real flaw of the U.S. founding fathers, according to David Paul of the United Kingdom, writing recently, were inherent in their motivation for the revolt against British rule, since they objected to a government that sought to protect peaceful Indians from the theft of their land and feared a court system that had started to have grave doubts about enforcing slavery. That is Somerset's case. Quote, they therefore had to create a devolved structure that would stop central government from interfering with local courts' enforcement of land grabs or enforcement of slavery, he asserts. Whatever the case, it is evident that there is a disjuncture between the supposed progressive and avant-garde import of 1776 and the worsening of conditions for Africans and the indigenous that followed upon the triumph of the rebels. Moreover, despite the alleged revolutionary and progressive impulse of 1776, the victors went on from there to crush indigenous polities and moved overseas to do something similar in Hawaii, Cuba, and the Philippines. Then unleashed its counter-revolutionary force in the 20th century in Guatemala, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Indonesia, Angola, South Africa, Iran, Grenada, Nicaragua, let me add Korea, and other tortured sites too numerous to mention. Ah, so now do we see how 1776 is just that counter-revolution and how it is reflected in the later conflicts? Again, Hawaii, Cuba, the Philippines. Oh, we always hear about these things starting with the US needing war and then going out and capturing these colonies. I bet you didn't think of it starting in 1776. Can I please get a thank you, Gearld Horne, in the comments, please? If they ever taught us in school that English abolished slavery first, this all would have been apparent. Yep, and that's because they misdirect those facts on purpose. So again, let's get a thank you, Gearld Horne, in the chat. All right, I believe this is the last part here. This is 248. I just want to scroll down right quick. Oh yeah. Oh boy. Okay, this is the very last section right here. It is also worth reiterating that the potent concept that is racism is necessary but insufficient in explaining the past and present plight of those who are now designated as African American, quote unquote. More to the point, this beleaguered grouping has endured the misfortune of fighting and losing a struggle that led to the formation of a slaveholding republic, then a Jim Crow regime, and then becoming enmeshed in the inevitable structural inequality that flowed from indecisive victories over powerful antagonists determined to implant bondage and apartheid. Of course, there have been self-inflicted wounds over the decades, poorly understood, foremost being some U.S. Negroes' participation in the assault on Native American sovereignty as Reconstruction was writhing in its death throes. Nevertheless, it has been inadequately comprehended that those of African descent in North America have suffered grievously from economic cum political persecution too. Their clumsy attempts to adhere to the diktat of Euro-American elites notwithstanding. The simple term racism does not necessarily encompass this multi-headed hydra. This is the sad destiny of those who have not triumphed wholly over powerful forces. It is also the case that it is much too generous to conclude that the former slaveholding republic had suffered from a tragic flaw. It is more accurate to aver that this policy has suffered from a design flaw. That is, that it is not accidental that the fabled founders somehow forgot to include all of the former colony's tendencies in its bounty. Unavoidably, this design flaw led to a blazing conflagration that concluded formally in 1865. In some ways, 1776 was an outgrowth of 1688, the result of free trade in Africans, and resulted restiveness of an overwhelming slave majorities in the Caribbean that drove the crown to retrench on the mainland and the concomitant growth of the productive forces there, allowing North American colonies to strain at the leash held by colonizers. Likewise, 1861 was an extension of 1776. The failure to resolve the nettlesome matter of slavery, indeed augmenting this atrocious institution, culminated in a bloody civil war. Strikingly, the supposed trailblazing republic and its allegedly wondrous constitution had a fatal design flaw in the form of enhanced slavery, which caused it to crash and burn by 1861. As with Lincoln's anti-slavery edict, Lord Dunmore's offer applied most directly to Africans whose masters were not on his side. Like Lincoln, Lord Dunmore faced a strategic disadvantage on the battlefield, which forced his hand. Williamsburg had an African majority, but was also a tinderbox of rebel enthusiasm. In this context, his edict was too attractive to resist, resistance London's forces were stretched thin, reaching deep into the Caribbean not least. The long history of Africans rebelling against colonists was a lore that Lord Dunmore could hardly ignore. But for the Africans who sided with London and Lord Dunmore, their decision, though understandable, was catastrophic, as the victorious rebels were able to claim the high ground of the Enlightenment, making their foes, even enslaved ones, appear to be misguided counter-revolutionaries. The dilemma for those tarred as pro-London Negroes, which in the eyes of some meant the entire population of the enslaved, metamazed when the new republic flung open the doors for immigration. Thus, the First Congress of 1790 enacted a naturalization rule that made citizenship relatively simple to obtain for Europeans. Free white persons, quote unquote, who resided in the United States for as little as 2 years could become naturalized. Subsequently, nativists complained bitterly that some of those gaining citizenship scarcely knew of the Republic's existence before arriving at a mainland port. Yet, like starry-eyed devotees of the Enlightenment, they failed to note how this naturalization process aided Republicans in overcoming the demographic challenge delivered by so many Africans and indigenes. Of course, to be fair, 1776, with its determined assault on the divine right of monarchs, was inspirational globally, even to those who sparred combatively with the Republic, such as Ho Chi Minh and V.I. Lenin. This foreign embrace of 1776 may be more a result of diplomatic niceties than protocol than anything else. And this is what I think as well. I think Gearld Horne is right in this in this kind of estimation here. That yes, they were probably somewhat inspired, but that I think it was more the case that this foreign embrace of 1776 was more of a diplomatic nicety and a protocol, especially in the face of like the existing communist parties in those countries at the time, right? The anti-monarchical emphasis of the Republican revolt pragmatically forged a wider base of support by which the crown could be attacked. It is not self-evident that this aristocracy of class and ascendancy that obtained in London was less humane and more retrograde than the aristocracy of race that emerged in the aftermath of 1776, and the territory stretching south from Canada. Speaking of Canada, this massive nation is kind of a control group, allowing for a measurement of the fruits of 1776. Is it the case that those groups, for example, Africans and Indigenous in the first place, who have been disfavored south of the St. Lawrence Seaway, have fared worse than those of like ancestry north of this artery, notably in the way that would justify and sacralize the bloodletting that created the Republic? And speaking of more loyal appendages of the erstwhile empire, it is quite telling that Australia, so similar to the US in so many ways, has endured a raging controversy about its origins as a violently implanted redoubt of white supremacy in a way that dwarfs and overshadows any conversation in the presumed revolutionary republic. It is also true that the Republic became a welcome refuge for asylum-seeking, fleeing barbarism in Europe. But context is necessary here too. The despotic dictatorship of Rafael Trujillo in Santo Dominico played a similar role, particularly for Jewish refugees who were turned aside elsewhere in the 1930s. But few would downplay his meritocratic moves in seeking to perfume via widening his malodorous rule by doing so, or would fail to consider his contemporaneously complementary massacring of darker-skinned Haitians in the thousands. It would be ironic indeed if a perverse form of affirmative action were deployed to excuse or rationalize the misdeeds of a budding superpower, while trumpeting racially questionable offers of refuge, than simply castigating similar misdeeds of a developing nation. Yet, though the creating of revolutionary regimes in France, China, and Russia, among others, has been subject to withering analysis of their respective real and imagined liberties, the United States of America largely has escaped similar scrutiny of its origins. Though it has been apparent for some time that the blessings of liberty escaped the grasp of the Africans and the indigenous most terribly. And this was hardly a matter of happenstance. And to suggest blithely, as some have, that 1776 created a template for the subsequent extensions of liberty to those who were initially excluded is similar to giving the jailers of apartheid credit for the enfranchisement of Nelson Mandela, while eliding neatly the stark commonalities that have linked white supremacy on both sides of the Atlantic. Indeed, giving the braiding of slavery with independence in the origins of 1776, and the emergence of a superpower as a result, it is unavoidable that those who were concerned with the overturning the toxic legacy thereby created have to build more consciously and forthrightly an anti-racist pro-equality movement of global proportions. Sadly, simply tinkering legislatively and judiciously in the domestic realm, given the current balance of forces, is plainly not up to the gargantuan task at hand. This conclusion also derives from the many years I have spent as a political activist, as executive director of the National Conference of Black Lawyers, and as counsel to the premier hospital workers union, now headquartered in Manhattan. After voting in and participating in numerous US elections, including that of 2012, I find it striking that today the pundits are buzzing about the imminent decline of the Republican Party in the light of the fact that this entity depends heavily on the white vote, in a nation where this group's percentage of the electorate is declining. Yet, remarkably few of those who actually inquire as to why this sector tends to lean in a conservative direction, and least of all, the deep historical roots of this phenomenon in a nation where not only was citizenship determined on racist basis, but furthermore, benefits were dispensed by the state in a similar fashion, and not just to elites. Few of the pundits have wondered if conservatism among Euro-Americans, notably in the working class and middle class, may hark back to the founding of the Republic, and a time when opportunity, including becoming an owner of lands once controlled by the indigenes and stocked with enslaved Africans. Many in these classes likewise scrutinize with skepticism the opportunity today for multiracial, multi-class coalitions, which have advanced considerably beyond this troubled, though still blindingly heralded era. After all, when a comfortable majority of Euro-Americans voted across class lines for Klansman and Nazi David Duke for governor of Louisiana in 1991, was this a simple display of false consciousness? Or a cagey wager that the clock of history can be reversed? Particularly when there is glorification of the grimy origins of a former slave-holding republic. Surely, the pro-Nazi majority had little incentive to dismiss the Black Scare, which helped to propel a good deal of Duke's success, when this phenomenon helped to propel the founding of the tendentously glorified republic in the first place. Meanwhile, the descendants of enslaved Africans continue to suffer astronomical rates of incarceration, are disproportionately accorded the death penalty, and endure all manner of ills, with few scrutinizing the origins of the Republic in search of a reason why. As I write, the ills just noted, which can fairly be seen as part of the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, continue to be worked out in the most advanced capitalist nation, where I happen to reside. This is a cautionary note when contemplating the trajectory of an alternative modernity: socialism. It would have been premature to administer last rights to capitalism on the basis of the horrors of slavery, and similarly, the well known human rights violations that accompanied the rise of socialism should not be interpreted to mean that this project too is destined for a permanent internment. These ills, which continue to afflict the descendants of enslaved Africans in North America, and the reasons why, which stretch back to the Republic's foundings, are an issue that should animate the study of and activism within what is now the US as the 21st century unwinds. And there you have it. Solution